surrendering to the Russians. Not because they don't want to fight, it's because they can't fight anymore. I think all of the lies that have been told for more than a year and a half about the Ukrainians are winning.
Don't. It will change the face of war.
Colonel Douglas Macgregor has just revealed some startling truths about how the current U.S. government is politicizing various wars in the world for its own purpose, and this has got many people talking. According to him, the U.S. has decided to wage war to destroy Russia for its own reasons that have nothing to do with the interest of the Europeans and the people of the Western world. He also explained what will happen next. So what led him to this conclusion, and what does this mean for the U.S.? Join us as we discuss how Colonel Douglas Macgregor just explained what will happen next. In a recent interview, Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a retired U.S. Army officer and a military analyst, gave some startling answers to a series of questions. He was first asked, how dangerous is it for the U.S. to be spending $886 billion on defense? This is the amount that was recently approved by the House of Representatives. This figure surpasses the total budget of the next 12 countries, including Russia, China, and Great Britain. It also includes funding and maintaining over 900 foreign military bases. Is this just business as usual, no matter who is in the White House? His reply was, absolutely. It's a runaway train, enriching too many people on the Hill and inside the Beltway. He explained that, as President Biden and others have acknowledged, it keeps various production lines running, making both useful and unnecessary items. The main point is that it's deeply ingrained in the Washington culture. He also said that he thinks nothing will change until the U.S. faces a financial crunch, which seems unavoidable. Nassim Taleb and others have warned that it's only a matter of time before a financial crisis hits and stops this spending spree. Until then, nothing will change. In his own words, but the point is that it is deeply embedded in the Washington community, and there's not going to be any change until we're broke. He was then asked what advice he would give if he was the Secretary of Defense of the United States. He said the U.S. urgently needs a new national military strategy, something like NSC 68, but updated for the current situation. NSC 68 was the document that turned the containment strategy into a militarized one and ultimately led the U.S. to where it is today. He said the U.S. needs to craft a new national security strategy based on such a document and then pass it through legislation. But the most important principle must be that the U.S. will not use military force against anyone outside its borders unless it is attacked. That's the first priority. The second priority is to focus mainly and primarily on Western Hemispheric defense. That means securing its borders and its country in a broad sense, as well as its coastal waters. And then finally, reevaluating all the alliance commitments. He said the U.S. cannot afford and does not need all of them. The world has changed drastically since most of these agreements were made. That's the starting point. And then when you look at the military itself, you have to dramatically shrink all these regional unified commands, cutting their numbers. You have to reduce and merge the so-called functional commands into a bigger but more streamlined command and control structure. All of these things have to be done, and you would go from 44 four-star generals to about 10 or 9. In other words, you have to resize the national defense establishment in a way that is both compatible with a country's fiscal needs and re-examines what we call national security. According to the colonel, the U.S. needs to rethink its definition of national security, which currently means global military dominance by the U.S. and its armed forces. He said this is not necessary and, in fact, counterproductive, as it creates more problems than it solves. He was then asked if the U.S. should be involved in the conflicts in Africa and Syria as it is now. He gave a clear no as his answer. He said that anyone who has been to Africa would know that the last thing Africans need is more army people roaming around their neighborhoods. He said that Africa has many challenges, and the U.S. cannot fix them by intervening militarily. He said that by doing so, the U.S. ended up resembling the former colonial powers, such as the French, the British, the Portuguese, the Spaniards, the Belgians, and others. He said, "We don't want to do that. We want to do business with everyone. We believe in a free market, but we're going to protect our markets. We're also going to protect our citizens, but we're not interested in regime change. We're not interested in imposing societal norms on people who don't want them and don't need them. All of this has to change." And so the answer to Africa is absurd. No, let's stay out of Africa as much as possible. As for Syria, he said he had no idea what they were doing there when he was there. He said sitting on a very small area with a few drilling rigs and oil wells on the assumption that this was hurting Assad, that's nonsense. It's not our territory, and we're caught right between the Turks, the Kurds, and the Iranians, all of whom are fighting over land and power. Why should we be there doing that? In fact, the Kurds that are interested in fighting with the Turks are actually a small group. We just need to get out. We need to get out of Iraq. We still have 5,000 plus troops on the ground in 12 or 13 bases. They're all sitting ducks. What are they there for? To hide the fact that we failed in Iraq, that we were a huge strategic blunder. He said the U.S. should not be there. The U.S. forces are needed at home, on its borders. He was then asked if the U.S. should remain in NATO. He said that he thinks the U.S. should tell the Europeans, "We don't live in Europe. You do. We're happy to support you where it makes sense to do so, but ultimately, you have to defend yourselves. You have to be your own first responders." He said that's the first thing. The second thing is a European should become the supreme commander of Allied powers Europe. He said the U.S. has been in charge of the military affairs in Europe since 1945. He said this should be done by the Europeans. He said how they do that is up to them, and they should just go back to the original principles of the NATO alliance, which was not to attack anyone, not to project power outside of Europe, not to start wars, but to be purely defensive. He said the U.S. has to tell the Europeans that it is leaving, and it will not be Europe's first responder. He said that does not make sense, and the U.S. can quickly send reinforcements as it did before. He said it can do so with some air and naval powers, but not with ground forces. The president has publicly declared he wants Congress to approve $68 billion for Ukraine before they leave for Christmas. But it seems unlikely that this will happen, despite the intense lobbying that the president and his team and President Zelensky did earlier this month. The colonel was asked how long he thinks Ukraine can last as a military force trying to resist Russia as a government without U.S. aid. He said 30 days, and that's probably generous because as soon as they realize that we're not staying, you'll see the same kind of scenario unfold in Ukraine that you saw in Afghanistan, with all of the so-called brave and patriotic leaders stuffing as much money as they can in their cars, in suitcases and bags, and either driving or flying out of the country. He said in the case of Ukraine, he's sure the same thing will happen as soon as they understand that the U.S. is not going to provide any more cash for them to share among the various gangs and crooks in Ukraine, not just the government and the army. The game's over. Everyone bails out. It's done. He was also asked what he thinks about the story that Ukraine is doing a good job of resisting Russia and that Ukraine's defensive success is keeping other European nations safe from the Russian threat, unlike in the past. He said that's all rubbish. He said you have to look at Eastern Europe and Ukraine in particular the way the Romans used to look at the Eastern Mediterranean. If you examine the maps of the Roman Empire of North Africa and the Middle East, you will see that the Romans only focused on and intervened in the coastal areas. They did not go deep into the interior. They did not do it because there was no point in doing so. There is no strategic advantage for the Russians to invade Ukraine or to menace Eastern Europe. It's ridiculous. There was never any such plan. But the U.S. provoked Russians into intervening, and they did. They entered with the assumption, which proved to be wrong, that they could reach a deal with the Ukrainians. Now, to be fair to the position Moscow took, they, as you know, judge we did reach a deal. We, meaning the Ukrainians and the Russians, did reach a deal right with we interfered to ruin and wreck. Then the U.S. went ahead and told Zelensky, you will have the full scientific, industrial, and military powers of the United States of the NATO alliance. You are bound to win, and Zelensky trusted the U.S. Zelensky was more than happy to take the billions and billions of hard cash. It came pouring his way, along with all the equipment. And we know that the Ukrainians have lost about 500,000 dead, maybe more, and there's no way to bring them back. You're talking about a generation of young men, and if you think about it, this is in the span of 22 months and in the span of 110 days during World War I, which is all that the U.S. fought for in 1918, and it lost 110,000 dead. So you've got a count of dead about 5 times what the U.S. lost in 110 days over a span of 22 months. That's enough to ruin any country. especially a country the size of Ukraine, which was never the 40 million that it claimed to be at the beginning. He concluded by saying that the U.S.'s involvement in the Russia-Ukraine war is all about an elite class that revolves around Washington. It is linked across Washington, London, and New York City. The elite class has chosen to wage war to destroy Russia for its own motives that have nothing to do with the interest of Europeans and the people of the Western world. There's no justification for it. There were no armies ready to attack anyone. Remember what President Putin said: "We will have our requirements met." That means we will achieve our goals, but if for some reason we cannot, we will resolve them militarily. And what Colonel Douglas Macgregor has been trying to tell people from the start: Ukraine is as crucial and indispensable strategically to Russia as southern Texas, Mexico, southern Arizona, southern New Mexico, and southern California would be to the U.S. In other words, Putin is not going to give up on this, and if he has to move forces all the way to the west, he has the time. He has the forces. NATO is not getting stronger. It's a dying man walking. It too is on life support. Behind the scenes, everyone is saying, now what? And if you tell them, well, you know it's time for you to mobilize your armed forces and march east, they all stare at you as though you've gone crazy. And they're right to do so. They're not going to fight. Neither is the U.S. What do you think about this? Let us know in the comments section.